Episode 13, Counting Sheep. Rabineau walked with an unhurried pace as he drank in the early morning air. After leaving the inn, he had decided there wasn't enough of the townsfolk out and about for him to talk to. Instead of going back to the inn and suffering through the verbal war zone, he decided it was a good time to get some meditating in. So he had struck off for the woods on the outskirts of town. He hadn't gone far into the trees before Eris had came trotting in after him. Rabineau looked back, appraising the cat with an eyebrow raised. "Oh, shut up," Eris said, hissing at him softly. "You know I must stay within a certain proximity." "Uh-huh," Rabineau said slowly. "But the inn is centrally located in the village, and I've been cognizant of that barrier. You didn't have to come follow me." "I hate being silent," Eris muttered. "Listening to those two argue without the capacity to point out the flaws and shortcomings in both of their arguments. Ugh." She paused, sitting on her haunches before Rabineau and licking her paw. "It was maddening." "I can only imagine, Eris," Rabineau said with a smirk, turning and continuing into the forest. "What are you doing out here anyways?" Eris said, following behind the mage. "I thought you were going to talk to the townsfolk." "No one is really out and about yet," Rabineau answered, "and I'd feel awkward going door to door this early in the morning, so I'm going to meditate for a while instead. Let the village wake up before I go asking about." Eris purred. Well, well, well. Look at you being responsible for your training." "I've only just been able to expand my awareness to sense the will in the world around me," Rabineau said. "If that is a skill that is pivotal to my understanding of will magic, then I'm going to master it." "Oh, we shall see about that," Eris scoffed. "Gaining proficiency is one thing, but mastery? You have a very thick head, Rabbit. That is quite the lofty goal." "Criticize me all you want," Rabineau said, finally finding a suitable stump he could sit on. "Doesn't change my mind in the least." "Good," Eris said sharply. "You wouldn't be a good mage if I could sway you so easily." "I know," Rabineau replied with a smug grin as he settled in. "Now do me a favor and be quiet so I can focus." "Fine," she said indignantly. "Practice by your damned self, then." Eris huffed and stalked off into the foliage, muttering murderously under her breath. Rabineau smiled to himself, resting his hands loosely on his folded legs and closing his eyes. Immediately, Rabineau found himself in the room, the place in his mind where he could examine the mouth of his well. As always, he found the room to be nondescript, unimportant. He could feel the bounds of the room, but couldn't necessarily see them. The hole in the floor that was the mouth of his well sat as it always had, quietly beckoning him to revel in its depths. However, Rabineau felt that this was where his newest training would come into play. He calmly monitored his breathing and restricted the flow to measured increments, as before, using his heartbeat as a metronome. As Rabineau controlled his breathing in this manner, he felt a trance-like state come over him. He then sensed the bounds of his mental room beginning to expand. With a start that nearly upset his meditative breathing, Rabineau realized just how claustrophobically small that space had been. As he maintained the state and he felt the bounds grow further away, he intrinsically understood that he was accomplishing the same feat he had in the pine grove days prior. He had simply combined the meditative aspect with the introspective one he had already practiced gratuitously. The result was a mental visualization of the world around him, revealed slowly as the bounds expanded outwards. What Rabinos saw in his mind's eye was quite different from what he witnessed with his ocular pair. Instead of color and solid structure, stark lines and contrasts, light and dark. What he saw in his mind was far more muted. Small lights, like distant stars in the night, began springing into existence all around him. Some smaller, some brighter, many of which moved ever so slightly. These lights were the only thing to illuminate the darkness outside of his mind's room. Further out his conscience expanded, and then there were bright collections of lights, strings that grouped together tightly, adding their strength and their light to the whole. Great columns of bright light illuminated the patchwork writhing over the ground that reminded Rabineau so much of the cosmos above. Trees, Rabineau realized. The columns of light are trees. Rabineau was fascinated by what he witnessed in his mind's eye. Eris had been right all along. The world was full of will, full of wonder and magic. How long were you planning on sitting here? Eris broke into his meditative state, shattering his concentration. With a frustrated huff, Rabineau opened his eyes and scowled, but Eris wasn't there. He looked around suspiciously, but saw no sign of the eternal cat. Finally, Eris's head poked down from the top of his vision. She had been perched directly on his head, using her own magic to keep him from noticing her weight. Sit here any longer, and it will no longer be morning, but noon, and then afternoon. Do you have to do that? Rabineau glared up at the cat. Eris quirked her head to the side. Would you rather I let you sit here all day, wasting precious daylight after you had already professed wanting to speak with people today? No, Rabineau said sharply. I mean, do you have to sit on top of my head? Oh, Eris said, that. She paused and leapt lightly to the ground before Rabineau, turning and sitting on her haunches, regarding the young mage. My dear rabbit, the only things I have to do is stay within a certain distance and not kill you. She paused and quirked her head sideways once more. Everything else is fair game. Rabineau sighed, stretching as he got up from the stump. I'm glad we have such a dynamic and respectful relationship. Is that sarcasm I hear? Eris said wryly. We get a day out from the chateau and little Rabbit starts coming out of his shell. How adorable. You are such a pain in the ass, Rabineau growled as he got up stiffly from the stump, stretching as he did so. Thank you, Eris purred. I merely aim to match your own tenacity on the subject. Whatever, Rabineau said, scowling at the cat once more. Let's go. What? Eris said, following after the mage as he made his way back to the village. No witty repartee? I've grown rather fond of your little quips. I'm not going to play into your games, Eris, Rabineau said flatly. Life is a game, Eris said sharply, and if you don't play to win, then you are a fool. Rabineau turned and looked down at the cat. Life is not a game, Eris. Oh? Eris shot back. There are rules, consequences for your actions, and you often have to wait your turn. The cat gave a startlingly human shrug. Sounds like a game to me. There are real consequences for our actions, Eris, Rabineau argued. Pain, sorrow, death. These are things far too serious for a game. And, Eris continued, the level of the stakes are irrelevant. Whether the parameters be something as mundane as a board game or as dangerous as a battle of will, it remains the same. Simply because you do not like my observations does not render them incorrect or insignificant. Life is not a game, Eris, Rabineau snarled. Just because you are eternal and consequences for your actions are practically trivial does not mean that is the same for everyone else. Look, Rabbit, Eris said calmly, you are not providing any new arguments here. Clearly I have struck upon a tender spot. Perhaps we can agree to disagree. Rabineau scowled. You're giving up. That easy. Oh, I'm not giving anything up, Eris said, turning and continuing to walk towards the village. However, it was beginning to feel like I was arguing with a brick wall, and that just seems redundant. You are so frustrating, Rabineau said, following after the cat. I have no idea how Linrem put up with you for so many years. Eris scoffed. My dear boy, I put up with him. Living with that man was like turning the tables on our little disagreement. Only Lin was practically insane, so arguing with him produced some fascinating results. Fine, Rabineau sighed in exasperation. Agree to disagree. Now, quiet down, we're nearly back to the village. The pair were passing through the last few rows of trees before the clearing the village occupied, and Rabineau could already see that in the time he had been meditating, the people had awoken and were bustling about, cheerfully completing morning tasks. As they made their way into the neat collection of buildings, Eris jumped onto Rabineau's shoulders. The townsfolk greeted Rabineau with waves and smiles as he made his way through the village. He stopped and talked to the people he came across. As it turned out, Fadlan was as stereotypical as a quiet little village could get. The most contentious topics he came across were often scandalous rumors of the young folk running around with one another, discovering their newfound sexuality. Rabineau had never found himself in any sort of romantic or even non-romantic entanglement with anyone, and so when these topics came up, which was often, he would blush profusely and try to find the quickest exit to the conversation. Of course, this didn't help him find out if there was anything the townsfolk needed from him magic-wise, but Rabineau's embarrassment kept him from caring too much. Eris would giggle softly into his ear every time he found an excuse to leave a conversation that had turned to these topics. Rabineau would simply blush deeper, say nothing, and move on to the next person he could talk to. It wasn't long, however, the day progressing past noon into the afternoon, when it appeared that Rabineau had conversed with just about everyone in the village. He was sitting on a stump on the far side of the village, having just extricated himself from the blacksmith's wife, who was convinced that the miller's son was trying to woo her daughter. I swear, Rabineau said softly to Eris, all this village thinks about is sex. Well, Eris replied equally softly, what did you expect? When all you have to talk about with your neighbors is what everyone else in the village is doing, topics tend to dry up rather quickly. Besides, young love makes everyone reminisce their younger days when they were the ones being whispered about in hushed conspiratorial tones. It's madness, Rabineau complained. You've just never been in love, Eris said, so you don't understand. Of course I don't understand, Rabineau said, annoyed, which is what makes it all that much more uncomfortable. Oh, I know, Eris said joyfully. It is so much fun to watch. You know what? Rabineau stopped speaking when he heard a voice calling out from the woods behind him. Frowning, he turned and looked in the direction the voice had come from. A ways into the trees, a young man was walking about slowly, calling out as he went. It looked to Rabineau as if he were searching for someone. Making a quick decision, Rabineau rose from his stump and strolled into the woods towards the young man. Eris hissed and dug claws into his shoulder. This is how people get murdered, you know. Shut up, Rabideau hissed back. This guy may actually need my help. As Rabideau came closer, he saw that the man was indeed young, perhaps in his mid-20s. He was dressed in the common tan-colored garb that the villagers of Fatland preferred. Though he was marginally disheveled and his shoulder-length black hair was wild and untended. Rabideau closed the distance with the young man, greeting him when he turned to regard the approaching noise. The man acknowledged Rabideau's presence, but then immediately went back to scanning the woods around him, simply radiating anxiety. Is something wrong, friend? Rabideau asked. My name is Rabideau. Maybe I can help? The young man turned to Rabideau, nodding. Patrick, sorry, friend, but I don't have time to chat right now. My dog, Franklin, has gone missing, and I need to find him. Rabideau perked up. Does your dog go wandering off often? No, the young man said in exasperation. You don't understand. I'm a shepherd, and Franklin is my best sheepdog. When I woke up this morning and went to tend the herd, I found that 2 of the sheep and Franklin were missing. I've got the rest of the herd penned up for now, but I need to get them out grazing, and I can't do that without Franklin. Rabideau nodded, pulling a card from his pocket and offering it to Patrick. I think I can help you, Patrick. Wizard extraordinaire? Patrick asked incredulously, sizing up Rabideau. What are you, 12? Rabideau sputtered, blushing deeply. 16, actually. Rabideau raised an eyebrow. There I go doing that again. Patrick raised an eyebrow. Is this some sort of joke? No, Rabideau said quickly. I really am a will mage. I'm on a pilgrimage to better my magic, and part of that pilgrimage is helping the people I come across. And you think you can help me find my dog? Absolutely, Rabideau said. Do you think you could maybe take me to where Franklin disappeared from? You're serious? Patrick asked, the other eyebrow joining his partner, jumping into his wild hairline. Yeah, Rabideau said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Yes, I am. Patrick shrugged. All right, then. I suppose it couldn't hurt. Come on, then. Patrick led Rabideau through the woods, back the way he had come for a ways, until the trees gave way to pastures. Once they had broken through the foliage, they made their way to a small hut that was huddled on the corner of the pastures, as close to the village as it could be without being in the trees. Next to the hut was a wide paddock, where Patrick's flock of sheep were indeed still milling about, restlessly circling the enclosure, heads close to the earth, trying to graze the grass that wasn't there. As they drew closer to the hut, a loud barking came from the space between the paddock and the hut. A large doghouse was built in the narrow gap, the open portal facing the paddock, and from inside, a large, furry head was protruding, barking madly. Rabideau said as they continued to walk closer. I take it that's not Franklin? No, Patrick said with disgust. That is Jerry, and he's a shameless coward. As if to emphasize Patrick's words, Jerry the sheepdog whined loudly and withdrew his head from the opening as they drew closer, trembling so bad that he shook the doghouse softly. The barking stopped, but the whining continued, petering in volume as Jerry heard them come closer. Jerry, Patrick said irritably, rapping on the top of the doghouse. Shut up, you great big baby! The whining stopped, and Jerry poked his head back out of the door, cautiously looking around and the group gathering near his house. He still trembled slightly as he reached his snout up, trying to get at Patrick's arm. The man reached down and petted the questing nose, encouraging the large dog to come out from his house. He did, hesitantly at first, especially when he looked up at Eris perched on Rabideau's shoulders, and she hissed it softly at him. Eris, Rabideau growled softly, cut it out. She dug her claws gently into his shoulder in response. Jerry whined pathetically again, his tail sinking between his legs, but Rabideau reached out and petted the cowardly dog, making him pant happily and wag his tail slowly. So this is it, Patrick said, indicating the space around them. We come back here every evening unless we've gone out too far to make it back before dark. And then that is why I have Franklin. Jerry here is braver when Franklin is around, but not by much. He mostly just scares off anything curious enough to come close. Rabineau looked around, nodding. You woke up this morning, Franklin and 2 sheep missing, he summarized. Was there anything else you found odd? Was the paddock opened? Patrick shook his head. Nah, the paddock is always the first thing I check in the morning. Usually Franklin will spend the night right in the middle of the herd, a true sheepdog, that one. He gets up and greets me at the fence when I come out. But today he wasn't anywhere to be seen. It wasn't until I counted heads that I realized 2 of the sheep were also missing. I even scouted around, looked for signs of a fight. No blood, no torn up earth from a scuffle, no patches of fur or wool floating around, nothing. They were just gone. Rabineau frowned, a slight feeling of foreboding sinking into the pit of his stomach. Okay, he said, looking around slowly. Let me see what I can do. When Patrick made to follow Rabineau as he turned to inspect the paddock, Rabineau turned. It's actually better for me if I work alone. I know you're anxious to find Franklin, but having you hovering over me while I try to work isn't going to help. Patrick sagged slightly. Oh, he said. All right then. I'll take care of the sheep then. Thank you, Rabineau said with a smile. I will let you know when I found anything. Patrick turned and morosely walked over to the other side of the hut, where a small shed resided. He began poking around in the shed as Rabineau got to work. The first thing Rabineau did was double-check what Patrick had already told him. The paddock didn't seem to have any clear signs of tampering. The boards were all sturdy and in place, and the gate had a latch on it. Not impossible for an animal to open, but difficult. Rabineau looked into the paddock and visually examined the sheep. None had any signs of injury or even stress. They didn't act as if a predator was hunting their numbers. They merely seemed eager to graze. Satisfied, Rabineau turned from the paddock and started looking around the clearing, immediately surrounding the homestead. As Patrick had already stated, there were no visible signs of intruders or any sign that a struggle had taken place. Rabineau frowned. He certainly had a mystery on his hands. Human senses, Eris muttered into his ear. Remember, rabbit, utter garbage. Rabineau frowned. If Eris was giving him a hint, then there was a fair chance of evidence to be discovered, just outside of the periphery of his existing senses. She wouldn't come straight out and tell him what she was getting at, no. Throwing out breadcrumbs and watching Rabineau scratch his head over it was what Eris preferred. He took a second to consider his options. Then, slowly, he knelt in the grass next to the paddock, closing his eyes and focusing. He was in the room, as he had been that morning. As he knelt there, he contemplated Eris's words. Clearly, she had sensed something that would aid in his investigation. Either that or she was playing a trick on him, also possible. Though, given the circumstances, Rabineau didn't think she was attempting to make a fool of him. Thinking through his senses, he decided touch and taste were out, obviously. Hearing probably wouldn't help him either. That left sight and smell. Between himself and Patrick, they had already visually inspected the area and come up short. Rabineau doubted that enhancing his sight would do him much good, and he wasn't sure how he could accomplish that anyways. So, finally, Rabineau settled on smell. As he sat in the room, next to his well, he focused on the smells he was already picking up. Grass, dirt, sheep shit, the morning dew, even the soft undertones of his own body odor. Focusing, Rabineau sank into a rhythmic breathing, doing his utmost to sense every possible particle he could smell in every breath. Finally, Rabineau dipped his hand in his well. The resulting assault on his nose was nearly enough to disorient. The smells he was picking up now was staggering. He could smell the musk of the sheep, the dander and dirt clinging to Jerry's coat. He could even smell the sickly sweet scent of the mildew growing on the shady side of the little hut. In his mind's eye, Rabineau focused on the smells, honing and searching, sharpening his awareness and questing for something he had missed. After sifting through the bog of smells he was submerged in, he finally noticed something he hadn't quite picked up at first. A scent that was muted from the source no longer being present, yet potent enough to linger. It was different than the dirty dander smell of Jerry, though it was very similar. It was mixed with the scents of the sheep so delicately, Rabineau nearly missed it. He smiled. He had picked up Franklin's scent. Eris stirred on his shoulder, whiskers tickling the side of his face as she brought her mouth close to his ears and whispered softly, "You cease to impress, Rabbit. Well done."